email your friends in China, Australia, France, all over the world, that if they just go to booksandbooks.com, they can watch this event. And if, in fact, someone that lives in the continental United States and they're watching, they can also call up before the end of the event and have Martin personalize a book for them, and we will charge them for it and then ship it to them free. So how's that for an offer? And then also it'll be archived up on our website, as there are about another 200 archived up there now, and you can go back to the archive and see some of the other events that we've had as well. And I want to thank our friends from UA Media for doing this, and you'll notice the quality is really quite good. So I encourage you to do that. Also, there's no time for me at all ever to stand up here and not mention the Miami Book Fair, which is happening in about a month. So we have an amazing book fair lined up this year, starting with Alexander McCall Smith and ending with John Cleese. What could be bad about that? And in between, we have everyone from Richard Ford to people who are just escaping me right now. But it's a great lineup, and the Fairgoer's Guide, I think, is somewhere in the store, and you can pick one up if you want to find out all that's happening. But this afternoon, you know, often I'm asked why I do what I do, particularly these days with all the talk about Amazon and independent bookstores falling apart, but we're on the rebound, thankfully. But I am asked, why do I do this? Other than because I have a screw loose, it's because of afternoons like this, to be able to present one of the most important writers of our time. Also, parenthetically, to have been in business now for close to 30 years, to have watched Martin Amos's career develop over all of these years, and to have been kind of a bystander and periodically to have our lives intersect has been just really one of the great joys of my life as a bookseller. The last time we saw Martin Amos is when he came to the fair for a panel remembrance that we had of his friend and ours, the Hitch, Christopher Hitchens, someone whom we both dearly miss. Yes. It was a great afternoon in memory of Hitch, and even to this day I go up and look at YouTube events where he just takes out the saber and just chops people up left and right. It's marvelous to continue to watch. But now we're here to celebrate this novel, The Zone of Interest. It's really remarkable. The best description of this formidable new novel actually that I heard came from a customer. A customer who came in the other day saw that she might be here, and I might be misquoting her, but she came in the other day and she looked at the novel and she said, you know, I started the first part of this book a while ago and I had to put it down, and I would see it on my night table and I was afraid of it. She couldn't go near it for a while. It was that powerful. She went back to it and really found it to be what she thought it was, which was an amazingly moving, powerful novel. There have been other reviews, other than reviews here in the store. Richard Ford says of this book, The Zone of Interest is a tour de force of sheer verbal virtuosity and a brilliant, celestially upsetting novel inspired no less than a profound moral curiosity about human beings. It's stunning. Donna Seaman of Booklist says, how to write fiction about the Holocaust that reveals in new and significant ways its systematic horror and impossible legacy. Amos accomplished his feat in Time's Arrow, and now this brainy, intrepid, worldly, and virtuosic writer does it again in his 14th novel by ushering us into the poisoned minds of characters trapped in the death spiral of the final solution. An audaciously satiric and brilliantly realized tale about personal angst and mass psychosis and the immolation of self and soul. And from The Scotsman, surely his masterpiece, intelligent, terrifying, and comic. And our very own Connie Ogle, who's right here, and we thank her for covering books the way she does. Let's give Connie a big round of applause. And she says, how can a person adapt to such hellish circumstances? Could love actually flower in such a place? Is bearing witness a worthy goal? Those are the sorts of questions Martin Amis takes aim at in this pulverizing novel about identity and humanity. Under National Socialism, you looked in the mirror and saw your soul, Thompson, a character in the book, says grimly, who somebody really was. That was the zone of interest. Please give a really, really warm Miami welcome to Martin Amis.
Hi, can you all hear me? Yeah, you're my neighbours now, because we've got a place in Lake Worth in West Palm. So I'm going to be a good neighbour to you, and I hope you will to me.
Use your turn signal. Yes, please.
If you're interested in how novels start, how they're born, you're going to see exactly how this one came to me. And people say, why did you choose to write a novel about the Holocaust, and more recently, why did you choose to write another novel about the Holocaust? And you have to say, feeling slightly pretentious, that it's more the other way around, that the novel seems to choose you. And it all begins with an image, a character, a situation that just dawns on you, and you think, all you think about it is that I can write some fiction about this. I don't know if it's going to be a story, a novella, a novel, a long novel, but I can do something with this. And well, I'll read the first page and you'll see what the idea was. Chapter 1, The Zone of Interest. Thompson, first sight. I was no stranger to the flash of lightning. I was no stranger to the thunderbolt. Enviably experienced in these matters, I was no stranger to the cloudburst, and then the sunshine and the rainbow. She was coming back from the old town with her 2 daughters, and they were already well within the zone of interest. The zone of interest is what the Nazis called the greater Auschwitz area. And the emphasis on interest is money. Up ahead, waiting to receive them, stretched an avenue of maples, their branches and lobed leaves interlocking overhead. A late afternoon in midsummer, with minutely glinting midges. My notebook lay open on a tree stump, and the breeze was flicking inquisitively through its pages. Tall, broad, and full, and yet light of foot, in a crenellated white ankle-length dress and a cream-coloured straw hat with a black band, and swinging a straw bag. The girls, also in white, had the straw hats and the straw bags. She moved in and out of pockets of fuzzy, fawny, leonine warmth. She laughed, head back, with tautened throat. Moving in parallel, I kept pace in my tailored tweed jacket and twills with my clipboard, my fountain pen. Now the 3 of them crossed the drive of the Equestrian Academy. Teasingly circled by her children, she moved past the ornamental windmill, the maypole, the 3-wheel gallows, the cart horse slackly tethered to the iron water pump, and then moved beyond, into Cat Shed 1. Something happened at first sight. Lightning, thunder, cloudburst, sunshine, rainbow, the meteorology of first sight. And that was the image that came to me, a love at first sight type moment against a background that only reveals its strangeness with one particular object, which is the gallows. I better in a minute say who my main male characters are. Her name was Hannah, Mrs. Hannah Dole. In the officers' club, seated on a horsehair sofa, surrounded by horse brass and horse prints, and drinking cups of ersatz coffee for horses, I said to my lifelong friend, Boris Eltz, for a moment I was young again. It was like love. Now, Boris is a colonel in the Waffen SS, and the narrator, the I, is Angelus Thompson, who happens to be the nephew of Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's private secretary and the third most powerful man in the Reich. Love, said Boris. I said like love. Don't look so stricken. Like love. A feeling of inevitability, you know, like the birth of a long and wonderful romance. Romantic love. Deja vu and all the usual stuff, said Boris. Go on, jog my memory. Well, painful admiration, painful, and feelings of humility and unworthiness, like with you and Esther. Esther is a young Czech Jewish prisoner. That's completely different, said Boris, raising a horizontal digit. That's just fatherly. You'll understand when you see her. Anyway, I said, then it passed, and I just started wondering what she'd look like with all her clothes off. There you are, you see, said Boris. I never wonder what Esther'd look like with all her clothes off. If it happened, I'd be aghast. I'd shield my eyes. And would you shield your eyes, Boris, from Hannah Dole? Who'd have thought the old boozer would have got someone as good as that? The old boozer is what they call the commandant of Auschwitz. The old boozer. Think though, I'm sure he was always a boozer, but he wasn't always old. I said, the girls are what, 12, 13? So she's our age, or a bit younger. And the old boozer knocked her up when she was 18, when he was our age. All right, said Boris, marrying him was forgivable. She shrugged, 18, but she hasn't left him, has she? How do you laugh that one off? I know, it's difficult to... And we asked each other yet again, why would anyone bring his wife and children here? Here. I said, this is an environment more suited to the male. Oh, I don't know, said Boris. Some of the women don't mind it. Some of the women are the same as the men. Take your Auntie Gerda. She'd love it here. Aunt Gerda might approve in principle, I said, but she wouldn't love it here. Will Hannah love it here, do you think? I said, she doesn't look as though she'll love it here. No, she doesn't, but don't forget she's the unestranged wife of Paul Dole. Then perhaps she'll settle in nicely, I said. I hope so. My physical appearance works better on women who love it here. We don't love it here. No, but we've got each other, thank God. That's not nothing. And then he warns him off. He says, your chances, brother, are non-existent. Where, for instance? She's far too conspicuous. And you be careful. The old boozer may be the old boozer, but he's also the commandant. I said, still, stranger things have happened. Much stranger things have happened, said Boris. Yes, because it was a time when everybody felt the fraudulence, the sarcastic shamelessness, and the breathtaking hypocrisy of all prohibitions. I said, I've got a plan. Boris sighed and looked vacant. First I'll need to hear from Uncle Martin, that's Bormann. Then I'll make my opening move. Pawn to Queen 4. After a while, Boris said, I think that pawn's for it. Probably, I said, but there's no harm in having a good look. Just to show you what kind of man Angelus is at this point, he then goes and visits a young guard called, in my version, Ilse Gresser, who was hanged at the age of 21 when the war was over. Then he goes, he sort of noses around the camp and he gets a few glimpses of her and remarks, if not in dress, then certainly in silhouette, with her face occluded, Hannah Dole conformed to the national ideal of young femininity. Stolid, countrified, and built for procreation and heavy work. Thanks to my physical appearance, I was the beneficiary of extensive carnal knowledge of this type. I had hoiked up and unfurled many a three-ply dirndl. I had eased off many a pair of furry bloomers. I had tossed over my shoulder many a hobnail clog. I was 6'3". The colour of my hair was a frosty white. The Flemish shoot of the nose, the disdainful pleat of the mouth, the shapely pugnacity of the chin, the right-angled hinges of the jaw seemed to be riveted into place beneath the minimal curlicues of the ears. My shoulders were flat and broad, my chest slab-like, my waist slender, the extensile penis classically compact in repose with pronounced prepuce. The thighs are solid as hewn masts, the kneecaps square, the calves Michelangelan, the feet hardly less pliant and shapely than the great tentacle blades of the hands. To round out the panoply of these timely and opportune attractions, my Arctic eyes were a cobalt blue. All I needed was word from Uncle Martin, a specific order from Uncle Martin in the capital, and I would act. Good evening. Yes. On the steps of the Orange Villa, I found myself confronted by an unsettling little character in thickly knitted woolens and with bright silver buckles on her shoes. She's a witness. She's a Jehovah's Witness. They were arrested en masse because they wouldn't contribute to the war effort, but they were used as staff for the SS in Auschwitz. Is the master of the house at home? I asked. I knew perfectly well that Dole was elsewhere. He was out on the ramp with the doctors and with Boris and many others to receive Special Train 105. And Special Train 105 was expected to be troublesome. You see, I have a high priority. Humilia, said a voice. What is it, Humilia? Displacement of air further back, and there she was, Hannah Dole, again in white, shimmering in the shadows. Humilia coughed politely and withdrew. Madam, I'm so sorry to impose, I said. My name is Golo Thompson. It is a pleasure to meet you. Finger by finger, I briskly plucked off the chamois glove. Golo, she said. Yes, well, it was my first attempt to say Angelus. I made a mess of it, as you can see, but it stuck. Our blunders haunt us all our lives, don't you think? How can I help you, Mr. Thompson? Mrs. Dole, I have some rather urgent news for the Commandant. I don't want to be melodramatic, but a decision has been reached in the Chancellery on a matter that I know is his paramount concern. She continued to look at me in frank appraisal. I saw you once, she said. I remember because you weren't in uniform. Are you ever in uniform? What is it you do exactly? I liaise, I said, and gave a shallow bow. If it's important, then I suppose you'd better wait. I've no idea where he is. Would you care for some lemonade? No, I wouldn't put you to the bother. It's no bother for me. Humilia. We now stood in the rosy glow of the main room, Mrs. Dole standing with her back to the chimney-piece, Mr. Thompson poised before the central window, and gazing out over the perimeter watchtowers and the bits and pieces of the old town in the middle distance. Charming, I said. This is charming. Tell me, I said with a regretful smile, can you keep a secret? Her gaze steadied. Seen up close, she was more southern, more Latin in colouring, and her eyes were an unpatriotic dark brown, like moist caramel, with a viscid glisten. She said, well, I can keep a secret when I want to. Oh, good. The thing is, I said quite untruthfully, the thing is, I'm very interested in interiors, in furnishings and design. You can see why I wouldn't want that to get about. Not very manly. No, I suppose not. So was it your idea, the marble surfaces? My hope was to distract her and also to set her in motion. Now Hannah Dole talked, gestured, moved from window to window, and I had the chance to assimilate. Yes, she was certainly built on a stupendous scale, a vast enterprise of aesthetic coordination, and the head, the span of the mouth, the might of the teeth and jaws, the supple finish of her cheeks. I said, and the covered veranda? It was either that or the... Humilia came through the open doors with the tray and stone pitcher. Thank you, Humilia, dear. When we were again alone, I said mildly, your maid, Mrs. Doll. Is she by any chance a witness? Hannah held back till some domestic vibration undetectable by me freed her to go on, not quite in a whisper. Yes, she is. I don't understand them. She has a religious face, don't you think? Very much so, I said. Humilia's face was markedly indeterminate. Indeterminate as to sex and indeterminate as to age. An unharmonious blend of female and male, of young and old. Yet, under the solid quiff of her crest-like hair, she beamed with a terrible self-sufficiency. It's the rimless glasses, I said. How old would you say she is? 35? She's 50. I think she looks like that because she thinks she's never going to die. Well, that would be very cheering. And it's also simple, she said. She bent and poured, and we took our seats. Hannah on the quilted sofa, I on the rustic wooden chair. All she's got to do is sign a document, and that's the end of it. She's free. Just abjure, as they say. Yes, but you know, Humilia couldn't be more devoted to my two girls. And she's got a child of her own, a boy of 12, who's in state care. And all she's got to do is sign a form and she can go and get him. And she doesn't. She won't. It's curious, isn't it? I said, I'm told they're meant to like suffering. And I remembered Boris's description of a witness on the flogging post. But I would not be regaling Hannah with it the way the witness pleaded for more. It gratifies their faith. Imagine. They love it. 7 o'clock was now nearing, and the room's blushful light suddenly dropped and settled. I had had many remarkable successes at this phase of the day, many startling successes, when the dusk, as yet unopposed by lamp or lantern, seems to confer an impalpable license, rumors of dream-strange possibilities. Would it be so unwelcome, really, if I quietly joined her on the sofa and after some murmured compliments took her hand and, depending on how that went, gently smoothed my lips against the base of her neck? Would it? My husband, she said, and stopped as if to listen. The words hung in the air, and for a moment I was jarred by this reminder, the ever more bewildering fact that her husband was the commandant. To remind you, one of the most prolific murderers in history. But I endeavored to go on looking serious and respectful. She said, my husband thinks we have much to learn from them. From the witnesses. What? Oh, you know, strength of belief, unshakable belief, the virtues of zeal. That's what we're all meant to have, isn't it? She said. I sat back and said, one could see why your husband admires their zealotry, but what about their pacifism? No, obviously, in her numbed voice she went on, Humilia won't clean his uniform or polish his boots. He doesn't like that. No, I bet he doesn't. At this point I was registering how thoroughly the invocation of the commandant had lowered the tone of this very promising and indeed mildly enchanting encounter. So I softly clapped my hands and said, your garden, Mrs. Dole. Could we? I'm afraid I have another rather shameful confession to make. I adore flowers. And out they go. A paradise, I said. Such gorgeous tulips. They're poppies, she said. Poppies, of course. What are those ones over there? After a few minutes of this, Mrs. Dole, having not yet smiled in my company, gave a laugh of euphonious surprise and said, you know nothing about flowers, do you? I do know something about flowers, I said, perhaps dangerously emboldened, and it's something not known to many men. Why do women love flowers so? Go on then. All right, flowers make women feel beautiful. When I present a woman with a plush bouquet, I know it will make her feel beautiful. Who told you that? My mother, God rest her. Well, she was right. You feel like a film star for days on end. Dizzily, I said, and this is to the credit of both of you, to the credit of flowers and to the credit of womankind. And Hannah asked me, can you keep a secret? Most assuredly. Come. There was, I believed, a hidden world that ran alongside the world we knew. It existed in potentia. To gain admission to it, you had to pass through the veil or film of the customary and act. With a hurrying gait, Hannah Dole led me down the cindery path to the greenhouse, and the light was holding, and would it be so strange, really, to urge her on inside, to lean into her and gather in my dropped hands the white folds of her dress? Would it, here, where everything was allowed? She opened the half-glass door and, not quite entering, leaned over and rummaged in a flower pot on a low shelf. To tell the truth, in my amatory transactions, I hadn't had a decent thought in my head for 7 or 8 years. Earlier, I was something of a romantic, but I let that go. And as I watched Hannah curve her body forward with her tensed rump and one mighty leg thrown up and out behind her for balance, I said to myself, this would be a big fuck. A big fuck. That's what I said to myself. Now righting her body, she faced me and opened her palm, revealing what? A crumpled packet of Davidoffs, a packet of 5. There were 3 left. Do you want one? I don't smoke cigarettes, I said, and produced from my pockets an expensive lighter and a tin of Swiss cheroots. Moving nearer, I scraped the flint and raised the flame, protecting it from the breeze with my hand. This little ritual was of high socio-sexual significance, for we dwelt in a land, she and I, where it amounted to an act of illicit collusion. In bars and restaurants, in hotels, railway stations, etc., you saw printed signs saying women asked not to use tobacco. And in the streets, it was incumbent on men of a certain type, many of them smokers, to upbraid wayward women and dash the cigarette from their fingers or even from their lips. I find it helps a bit, she said, with the smell. That last word was still on her tongue when we heard something borne on the wind. It was a helpless, quavering chord, a fugal harmony of human horror and dismay. We stood quite still with our eyes swelling in our heads. I could feel my body clench itself for more and greater alarms, but then came a shrill silence, like a mosquito whirring in your ear, followed half a minute later by the hesitantly swerving upswell of violins. There seemed to be no such thing as speech. We smoked on with soundless inhalations. Hannah placed the 2 butts in an empty bag of seeds, which she then buried in the lidless rubbish barrel. Thank you. Should we have questions? Or?
Yeah, it seemed to me one of the comic horrors of the book were the...
Sorry, could you stand up?
It seemed one of the comic horrors of the book, maybe more horror than comic, was the commandant's obsession with the logistics of running a death camp. And I just wondered how much of that was your imagination and how much...
How much of the commandant's?
His obsession with the logistics of running a death camp.
Oh, a book that was a great help to me was Commandant of Auschwitz by Rudolf Höss, written in his death cell in Poland in 1945-46. And it's almost a great novel by Nabokov, a narrator whose self-knowledge is nil. And Primo Levi wrote the introduction to this book and said, despite his efforts to defend himself, the commandant comes across as who he is. A coarse, stupid, pompous, long-winded scoundrel. and that's what he is, and that's what I with all sorts of variations, I transferred that to the character of Hannah Dole. They were just thinking about logistics and how to burn the bodies. That was a great obsession. And the Nazi doctors there were many Nazi doctors there, got very interested in that, in just the physics of it. How do you do it? And how to make sure that the fire doesn't get so hot that you can't get near it, etc. And they, of course, count the bodies. And there's a terrible bit when he says to his helper, who's one of the Sonderkommando, the special squad of Jews who, to prolong their lives a few weeks, process the dead bodies of their kinsmen and women, and who also thread themselves among the prisoners as they arrive on the ramp, and say reassuring things to them. So the most degraded possible. But he says to him, now you will count the bodies, because I have to file the figures. And when he has counted them all, it takes months. They're digging up the dead that they killed earlier. And when he comes up and says, he said, counting the skulls is no good, sir, because they've all been shot, most of them have been shot in the back of the neck, and sometimes the skull is fragmented, shattered. He said a much more sound method is to count the femurs and divide by 2. And then he says 107,000, he says, and Dole says, so now I divide by 2. And he said, no, I've already done that. So. And that figure is in Rudolf Hesse's book. I feel very uneasy when people say comedy. It's much closer to satire. Comedy, the trouble with comedy, it puts you in mind of laughter that is light-hearted. And in fact, human beings don't just laugh out of gaiety or in response to irony. It's a very versatile human response with a great scope and variety. And we laugh out of disgust, hysteria, madness, contempt, relief. To say comedy, immediately the humorless will seize on that and say, well, it can't be serious. So I'm easier with a description that is closer to satire, which is a much bitterer form.
All right, so next question is over here.
Hey, I remember when you were doing the press tour for The Pregnant Widow, you were talking to Charlie Rose about the different responses you had toward your mother's death and your father's death, and you were talking about how your mother's death inspired just despair, whereas there was a sense of promotion, kind of, in the wake of your father's death. And all throughout your career in your nonfiction, you've been very vocal about your admiration for older writers, Burgess and Bellow and Roth and Updike. And I'm wondering if now that most of those elder male role models have died, do you feel that same sense of promotion, or is there a sense that you're inheriting a throne, or is it just kind of an emptiness that they're gone?
No, it doesn't seem to work like that. With the death of the father, you actually feel a sort of a sense of physical levitation, and it's not that you're saying, "Ooh, I'm number one now," or indeed that the intercessionary figure between you and death has disappeared, or one of the intercessionary figures. It's a physiological response. When it comes to the writers, no, that never occurs to me. What I do feel, and I've been thinking about this with regard to Christopher Hitchens, is that the great thing about one of the great unremarked benefits of the writer's life is that you mingle with writers, and your friends are writers, and when they die, they're still there. And when I miss Christopher, I pick up a book of his, and I'm not only sort of, as it were, chatting to him, I'm chatting to him at his best, at his most, stretched and most brilliant. And I do that with my father's books and with Saul Bellow's books, and it's an incredible thing. And I do think that when I die, my children will be able to do that. And it's more a continuum with other writers. There's not a breaking point.
Our next question is back here, and then I'll get to this lady next.
I was curious, besides Saturn III, what is your favorite American film?
Oh. Raging Bull. That's a great movie. Yeah, it is.
I love your writing, and one of my first jobs was working for Saul Bellow at the Aspen Institute. And I know you were very, very good friends, and that he was one of your mentors. And I see the same satirical feeling, and you have a mastery of people's feelings. For example, in this book with the Nazis, and I'm just wondering, did you ever face-to-face interview or speak to a real person that was at a camp as a guard, or
No, I never have, and I might think about it now, but I would have avoided it while writing about it. There's a very delicate balance between doing too much research and doing not enough, but it's better to do not quite enough than to do too much, because then you feel all these obligations in your mind that you've got to set that down. And I wonder if they are the people to talk to about it. I've read a lot of survivor testimony, and they are. It's a marvelous rebuke to the Nazi idea, because these supposedly subhumans were in fact the cream of humanity in their statements, their wit, their aphoristic wisdom, their uniformly high level of perception. It wasn't just luck. Luck helped you survive, but there are other things you needed. You needed immunity to despair, the constantly cherished sense of your own innocence, which we can't really understand. And Solzhenitsyn stresses this again and again in the Gulag Archipelago, that it's a cleansing feeling that you are innocent. And the Sonderkommando, of course, can't even give himself that comfort. And luck, and getting an indoors job and all that. But I do think that the ones who survived were just, they all seem to have this thread of guilt in their thoughts about their survival, where they say to themselves that I was saved, but someone better was drowned. But there really could have been no one better. I think they're thrilling examples of humanity.
by the way, Saul spoke a lot about you.
Oh, no, good.
Who has a question or a comment from? Okay, let me get the microphone to you, miss, if you'd like to stand up.
Hi, my question is about your process as a writer and how you decide how much information you're going to provide for the context of your writing. So, for example, when you start this book, there's a lot, I think that your reader could either be very familiar with the Holocaust and the language of the Holocaust or not at all familiar. And I felt that you let a lot of, you used a lot of language and information that, without necessarily explaining it, but it gets explained later in the book. So I was just wondering, when you're writing, how much do you leave up to the reader to discover on their own versus describing it for them and laying everything out for them?
It's a good question. And I think the answer is that you feel your way. And I think, I mean, this book has been read by people who know a very great deal about it. And what surprises them and defamiliarizes it all is the dramatic situation. These characters who aren't, you know, they're always doing something else. The Holocaust is going on in the background. But I really just think that a reader who knew very little about the Holocaust could, you have to phase the information so that the picture builds. And, you know, whereas you never decide what your next novel is going to be, it's decided for you. That doesn't mean there aren't decisions when you're actually writing. And in fact, you make 40 or 50 decisions per page and just deal with each difficulty and ambiguity as it arises and just hope that your instinct is sort of true.
Martin, before we go to the next question, I have two questions for you. I was much intrigued by the afterword that you wrote as well. And I'd like to know a little bit about what your thinking was in creating that afterword. And the other question I have for you is the bit of the controversy about the French not publishing it, and what are your thoughts about some of that as well?
Well, that's sort of over as a subject because both the French and the Germans are publishing it now. Yeah, but I was very surprised, not so much by the French. Who could be surprised by the French? But for this reason, that when I was last in Germany, I said to my docent, my guide, I said, she said, at these public events, what do you want to talk about? And I was well into the first third of this, and I said, well, I could talk about the Holocaust, but they don't want to hear about that, do they? And she said, oh, yes, they do. And very much to my surprise, extremely well-informed, hungry for information and discussion about this. These are the young people. The previous generations denied it or tried to normalize it. That historical controversy in the 80s, where they said no, it was just it's just like Stalin. It's just like the Allies bombing Germany. You know, everyone was doing it. We're no worse than anyone else, and that's over. And they realized that these crimes and that 12 years was like a sort of tear in history, as a couple of German dissident diarists wrote at the time. They said, this is beyond history, this is outside history. And I think the Germans are now facing that, and you know, facing it squarely. The French, they've done practically nothing to expiate their collusion, their eager collusion, and sometimes unprompted collusion in sending 90,000 Jews to their deaths. Chirac said at one point, commemorating the roundup in Paris, where those children were treated so incredibly abominably, said this was a period of shame for France. And Mitterrand would never have done that. He said he would never do that. I would never apologize for France. There was a fascinating and terrifying poll, worldwide poll on anti-Semitism, where they presented the people they polled with a list of obviously anti-Semitic propositions, like the Jews only care about themselves, they have no loyalty to their country of residence, it's only to Israel, etc., etc. And gauge the degree of anti-Semitism in every country on earth. And the figures are really remarkable. In America is 9%, and Britain 8%, which is still twice as much as Sweden, which is 4%. But on the other hand, Iraq, 95%, Saudi Arabia, 88%. The most moderate of those Middle Eastern countries is Iran, with a mere 56%. Now you go to Europe, and where you'd expect the chastening effects of what anti-Semitism achieved in those years, not just in Germany, but also in Romania and elsewhere. Germany, it's, I think, 16%. Austria, slightly higher, because, as they said, they weren't very good Nazis, but boy, were they good anti-Semites. France, 37%. And the worst by far in Europe, Greece, 69%. Which very much suggests that anti-Semitism, this curious virus that's been with us for 4,000 years, comes alive when in times of economic dislocation. But there's a difference between admitting to anti-Semitism and genocide, and the crash and hyperinflation and so on, and Treaty of Versailles and all that is not commensurate with the events and does not explain it. It's more like Saul Bellow used to say it was a psychosis. Christopher Hitchens used to say it was more like a sort of intense neurosis that comes and goes. It's being called, anti-Semitism has been called the egalitarianism of fools. It's an objection to a level playing field. If you look at the recipients of the Nobel Prize, hugely disproportionate amount of Jews compared to their numbers. And I think I'm a Philo-Semite. I have been all my life, even as a child. I'm very attracted to Jews. Saul Bellow writes he writes quite sharply about American Jews who have decided to go American and abolish their Jewish past, and whether being Jewish was a quote-unquote consideration was something they weren't quite sure about. And he describes a lawyer who's managed to, and he says he's managed to divest his face of the Jewish charge, that sort of electrical charge. And instead he's got a look of absolutely bland reliability. Stupid goodness and reliability. But being so philo-Semitic myself, responding positively to the Jewish charge means an electric phenomenon that can take a positive or a negative form. And it even makes me cautiously wonder whether all the people who aren't anti-Semites are in fact Philo-Semites, that it isn't in us to react neutrally to the Jews, that their particularity, their peculiarity, their specialness is something that you will respond to one way or the other, but not neutrally.
Sounds like you don't like family.
Well, I know my family too, and the difference writing this novel to writing the Times Arrow 25 years ago is that my wife is half Jewish, my younger daughters are quarter Jewish, and I'm sort of I have consanguinity with these events that I didn't have before.
Did you want to talk about the epilogue?
Oh yes. Well, I had to have acknowledgements where I thank the writers who are most helpful to me, and historians, and Primo Levi above all, who was my lodestar, and then I felt that I had to offer a sort of essayistic explanation partly because it interested me so much, but I think the result is that you can see that I have looked at the history, and it's not lightly undertaken, and I think there are special responsibilities involved, but I don't accept at all some people like Claude Lanzmann, who made Shoah, George Steiner, whom I respect, and Cynthia Ozick, whom I respect, have said, that under Arbeit macht frei, there should be a sign saying novelists and poets not welcome. No poetry after Auschwitz and all that. I think that's philosophically a non-starter. There was poetry during Auschwitz. There was Paul Celan. There was Primo Levi, who was a poet and a novelist as well as a great memoirist. I think fiction is freedom. You have to be able to go where you want, and say this business with ISIS, Islamic State, if that got completely out of control, as you could imagine it doing, that something comparable to the Holocaust could take place in the Middle East. And at what point does the bar come down and say, you can't go there now? And I think one thing I learnt from the writer Sebastian Haffner is, and it I think very much applies to ISIS, is that Nazism was not an ideology. It's unlike Leninism, Marxism, or even Maoism, which went on sort of rails, ideological rails. Hitler only put forward about 2 or 3 ideas: land empire, Jewish world conspiracy, and racial supremacy of the Aryans, and that was that. And Haffner said it wasn't an ideology. It was a rallying cry for sadists. If you're prepared to beat and kill and rob for no reason, kill children, the old, then come to my banner. And those English jihadis who have joined ISIS, Jihadi John is one of them, a sort of eccentric from South London, from Walthamstow. Now he's there not because he wants the caliphate or because he's fanatical Islamist. He's there because he wants to kill people. It's a secret no longer well kept that killing for a certain type of human being is an ecstatic experience. It's a great infusion of power, and the powerless, the rightly powerless, respond to that. That's why they're there, and they that other thing that we'd find it so hard to understand. They like being feared. They like people looking at them with terror. And would you like that? But that is the sort of the warp that it appeals to.
Thank you. We have a question, Rosie.
About Time's Arrow in this book, I was reading the State of England one, and you have a couple of moments where some violent event happens, and you write it like a flash, like it's like this, and then this sort of horrible thing happens, and there's kind of an aftermath. And I always thought Time's Arrow was a very fast book, like you swept through, like it just cruised through like all these events at a high rate. But then this book is you're slowing down and you're sort of diving deeper into it. And I just wonder if was that really, again, this is an observation. I don't know if that's something.
Well, it's a feeling about violence that was given great substance when I read Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence has Declined. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago what I thought I was doing, what does it involve being a novelist, what are you actually achieving for the general good, I would say I'm in the education business. I hope to make my readers' perceptions richer and their thoughts richer, their response to life richer. That's not what I say anymore, having read Steven Pinker, because he definitively proves that violence has dramatically declined against all our intuitions, because we see so much of it, but it has declined, and he gives 4 main reasons for this. The invention of printing marked a real dip in violence. Of course, the rise of the state. Leviathan, who the state takes a monopoly of violence, disarms the people, and says, we're the only violent force. It's a thing America neglected to do. In the early 19th century, when everyone else was doing it, you decided it wasn't butch enough for you. The rise of women, very important. And this isn't just murder, it's consideration of animals, children, right across the board. It's got gentler. And one of the reason that excited me was he said the rise of the novel was a big factor, because it taught people. He doesn't like the word empathy, since he saw a woman in Harvard Yard screaming at her children, "Show some empathy, you little bastard!" But imaginative sympathy is what it is, and people suddenly started finding themselves sitting with a novel in, say, early 18th century, and suddenly they're Clarissa Harlow, suddenly they're Tom Jones, suddenly they're Sophie Weston, and they're inhabiting another human being. And that was sort of revolutionary. So that's what I say I do. And I think violence is the great curse of our species, and particularly of my sex. And anything that I turn out to have been doing that combats that, it seems to me noble.
Thank you. Of course, I remarked, like everybody else, that Hitler's name is not shown through the novel, which I thought was very powerful.
Sorry, what is
that
it?
Hitler's name does not appear in the novel,
Right.
which I thought was very powerful. And then you finish the book and you face Hitler's picture. So, and that was it's very strong emotion to see Hitler's face, and Martin Bormann as well.
Looking so loutish.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to put his picture in the book?
Well, I don't name him until we get to the afterward, and I think that's just perhaps over scrupulousness on my part. In the novel I wrote about the Gulag, Stalin's name appears only once in a footnote, and for the rest of it he's referred to as Joseph Vissarionovich, name and patronymic. But there was no way round Hitler. I mean, I'm not going to call him Adolf. And there seems just something pathetic with a B, sort of sublime to the ridiculous to type out those 6 letters. I felt it would be just crass to do that. So I have other names for him, Grofaz, as he was called, which is a sarcastic acronym for the greatest field marshal of all time. They started calling him that in 1943, when the war was clearly lost. And I call him the Virgin Priapus, the vegetarian Tyrannosaurus Rex. That terrible mixture of continence and absolute madness. The Reichskanzler, the Generalissimo, there are ways around it, but I didn't want to type out those letters, not till the end. It's an amazing fact that I've never seen really stressed, that no historian claims to understand him. In fact, nearly all of them make a point of saying they don't understand him. Some, like Alan Bullock, say that the the more they know about him, the more difficult they find it to understand. He is in a. Was it something metaphysical that happened in Germany, or was it just the result of putting it about for several years with this new art of propaganda that cruelty was a virtue, and that's what you get if you put that about. Cruelty is a virtue to be rewarded with power and preferment, but there is a sense in which Hitler isn't human. Counter-human is what Primo Levi calls him, and I'm sure that that it has to do, and I'm not being frivolous or simplistic, it has to do with the sexual nullity of Shakespeare. I mean, of Hitler. There are three schools of thought about his sexuality: the school of normality, the school of asexuality, the school of perversion. Now, I don't go along with the perversions that have been suggested because they're all so indescribably filthy that it's an obvious attempt by psychiatrists and so on to find an objective correlative for the filth we know that was in his head. As for normality, I can't see Eva Braun enjoying a husky post-coital cigarette while Hitler towels himself down after a tender and resourceful performance in bed. So I would say quite a few people said he's a neuter, and I think that's where I would put my emphasis, because when a character comes into a novel, you know all about their sexuality. That's the first subconscious recognition you have, and I would say he was a bit perverted, but in a sort of petty bourgeois way. The other thing I call him is the petty bourgeois antichrist. But so I imagine, and he was also fanatical about cleanliness, and so was she, Eva Braun. So I imagine it went something like this, that it would be a tease not to tell you what I think he got up to, that he would fortify his underpants with a thick layer of clean napkins and serviettes. Then he would have Eva Braun at a safe distance do something like sort of lift her skirt, and then he would get into some sort of state of excitation, and there would be come to a sort of soggy conclusion. But skipping the tumescent stage as well. He used to have injections of bull semen, timed for Eva Braun's visits to the Berghof, but we don't know if they worked. And in fact, no one knows what he got up to sexually. But sexuality is one of the ways we recognize fellow human beings, whatever it might be. And Stalin, for instance, two marriages, 3 children, at least as many byblos, many affairs with wives of party colleagues, hairdressers, florists, that sort of thing. We recognize him, and no one's very mystified by Stalin. But Hitler, he just doesn't register on that human scale, and I think that's part of his inscrutability.
2 more questions over on this side. Who was first?
Hi, thanks. I don't even know how to ask the question. My dad's a survivor and deeply traumatized man, and I've kind of had to struggle with him my whole life.
Sorry, please speak up a bit.
Sorry, my dad's a survivor and obviously a very traumatized man who won't deal with it. And it's kind of, to me, it's sort of left it to me to deal with it in a strange way. And
who did your?
My father.
Ah.
And I find that I have, I struggle with a certain rage at, I don't know who, Nazis, Germans, and it's, but I realize it's my problem. I was even told by a psychiatrist, you've got to learn how to forgive because you're both on the same hanging by the same hook then. And I wanted to ask you about that idea of forgiveness. How, I don't even know how to ask the question. What's the question that I should ask?
All the survivors I've read, with the exception of Shimon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter, abjure revenge, say I'm not interested in revenge, but not one of them forgives. Don't want revenge, but don't even mention forgiving. So I think it would be utopian to think you could ever get to that point where you could forgive. It's amazing how often that does happen in murder trials, for instance. But this, Hitler defaced the very image of man, and that we don't forgive.
Hey, thanks for coming to Miami. Great to see you. And thanks for the early mention of Nabokov, because what I was thinking as you're reading the first few pages of this book was in the beginning of Lolita when he says something about count on a murderer for fancy prose style. So it was a nice echo. But
you can always tell a murderer by his fancy prose style.
Yeah. Do you know Tim Snyder's book Bloodlands? It's a recent.
Yes. Yeah.
That came a dozen or so years after your Stalin book and after you wrote often. Why is it okay to be an old lefty, but not okay to be an old righty? Because the old lefties got up to as much mischief. And in Snyder's book, you finally begin to get the picture. We have the impression that the Russians just sort of blunderingly killed tens of millions of people, and that the Nazis very coldly killed the people that they killed. And then we learn from Snyder's book how for the first decade of that 12,
in
15
the Ukraine,
year range, that the Russians were disturbingly methodical and kept the sorts of records and the kind of discipline that we associate with the other side of the fence. And I just, so to take the discussion earlier about placing a novel, as you have done, in this setting, the outlines of this setting are more familiar. And I think in that sense maybe the novelist has a little less work to do maybe because the stage is built behind him. But I just don't, who can write that novel? And sorry I didn't read the Cope of the Dread book, but I will one day.
Well, House of Meetings is the novel about it. Koba is sort of popular history, amateur history.
Yeah. So who can write, this book to paint that picture too?
What, including the Russian?
Yeah. Again, to make sure that more people understand, as you pointed out, that there's a pedagogic piece of this in your choice, to make sure that people understand that it wasn't, those careless communists in the 30s that just accidentally managed to slaughter millions, that they were in their piece of the map in some ways, if not as equally absolutely diabolical.
Well, no, and because they're think of Stalin aged 25, a published and an anthologized poet with a beautiful singing voice, putting himself about a bit of rivalrous murders among his own sect. But what did he want at that stage? He wanted a country of universal justice. You can't imagine Hitler with a lovely singing voice writing poems. I mean, that dimension just isn't there. The crime that corresponds most exactly to the Holocaust, the Russian crime, is the terror famine in the Ukraine in 1932-33, where I think the numbers are disputed, but at least 7-8 million were deliberately starved to death. And that does make it analogous with the Holocaust, because you're watching your whole family starving to death. And Vasily Grossman has written a terrific novel, Everything Flows, about that. and reports that for instance, with the starving children, some mothers just screamed and ran away from their children, and others were completely loving right to the end, telling them stories, and but that's only a third or perhaps a quarter of the people put to death by Stalin. But that was a crime of neglect, whereas the Germans strike you as being so electrically proactive. Their massacres, just insane massacres, more bloodlust in the German crimes than in the Russian, perhaps, and with no prospect of anything but a monstrous future for the whole world, let alone for Germany.
For last questions, our friend Marzi Kaplan.
I have to say that we go back to much more than 20 years ago when first we heard you speak. And it may not have been your first time, but that was the first time we heard you speak across the street at the original Books and Books. And it is our South Florida honor to have you here again and again, and at the Miami Book Fair, and we are all very pleasured to have had you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. It's really great.
All right, folks, and just a quick reminder that we have the signing table set up on the west side of the store. We have the books for sale at both counters. The signing line will go through the cafe, so let us steal Mr. Amos from you. And it's been a great honor having him here at the store today. Thank you very much.